I am here with a very, very important figure, someone I've been very, very excited to have on. I'm here with PhilosophiCat. PhilosophiCat, a lot of people will know, is a pretty standard expert on Julius Evola. And you can find PhilosophiCat on YouTube. You can find her on Twitter. You can find her on Subscribestar, where she has a series on Evola there. And you can also find her on Telegram, a very, very popular Telegram chat. And as you will notice, based on my language here, she is the first literal and unironic woman that we're having on the show. So, Kat, thank you very much for taking the time to sit down with me today.
My pleasure, and it's certainly my honor to be the first real woman on the show.
There's no pressure. I just want to let you know you have the entirety of the female race on your back.
Okay, no pressure, just breathe.
And before we start, I found that's one thing I found very interesting about your YouTube channel, especially, and your shorts specifically, is that you deal in perennialist topics. You deal with esoteric topics. But what I found most interesting is that you would take these high-minded esoteric topics and bring it down to the practical level for people. So if people were to look at your YouTube shorts, you would give these little short videos about messages to advice to women, advice to men, advice to how to lead a good traditionalist life. Does that sound like an accurate description?
Yeah, so the shorts were just taken from clips of existing videos, and it was just kind of an experiment we did because for a while the YouTube algorithm for shorts was not linked to the rest of your channel, and it was just interesting to see what kind of viewership that got relative to the long form videos. But we would like to do more shorts, and one thing that I like to do is I do, of course, like to just expound on traditionalist philosophy and the concepts and principles on a pure level. But I also really like to be able to bring it down into something practical and usable for the average person, because high-minded ideals are great, but there's always the question of like, well, what good is this for me? And so I like to try to, if I'm going to discuss some kind of modern phenomenon or cultural thing or whatever, I'd like to be able to apply traditional ideas to it and be like, all right, here's the situation in the modern world. What would tradition say about this? Is there a way that you can bring tradition into your life despite the fact that we live in the Kali Yuga?
That's a great point, and that's what inspired me to really want to have this discussion because on our show and in my own life and in our scene, this thing we call the dissident right, there's a lot of people who talk about tradition and who advocate for tradition. Some people are on the Christian side, some on the pagan side, but when it comes to tradition, Evola and the esotericists come up a lot. And Evola specifically, at least my reading of him, he was always very hostile to people who talked like they were adherent to tradition, but were really just still engaging with the world through the modern lens. And it was only him and a few others who really dared to go back to the roots of tradition and not engage with the world through a liberal sort of way. And I guess that's why I wanted to bring you on because we had also discussed Revolt Against the Modern World on the show long, long time ago. I'm not sure I gave it justice. Just like Rene Guénon, there's a way to read those books without in kind of like a modernist way to think like, oh, they're just complaining about materialism. But it's deeper than that. It's deeper than just, things are too materialist now. And I guess the point I was really trying to make was I think a lot of people get Evola wrong, or they think that he's just critiquing, a modern phenomenon. But his understanding of traditionalism is pretty alien to people. And I don't think people really engage with his idea of traditionalism. Would that be an accurate portrayal there?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different right wing milieus that have kind of latched onto the ideas of tradition as a reference point. That's an overall good thing, of course. Don't get me wrong, but I think because of the increasing interest in these ideas, there's often a sort of attempt to like water down what traditionalist means and maybe replace it with something that's less demanding or more accommodating of the modern world, or even just an outright misunderstanding. So, you know, when it comes to like looking at tradition, it is kind of important to consider both the metaphysical and esoteric aspects of it as well as its practical applications. If you're only looking at its practical applications, you're going to miss a lot of what Evola is trying to point to.
And that you raised a good point there, and that was going to be my first question. So, in a lot of ways, the more I look back in time, the more I look at these older texts and these ancient civilizations, their history themselves the histories themselves are more woven in with mythology and esotericism. So I had this question, and maybe this is a good one to start with. Uh, would an accurate view of history require a view of esotericism? Like to look that far back into history, does it require you to take esotericism seriously, and you can't just put it aside and look at the empirical history itself?
Well, it depends on what you're looking at history for. If you're just looking to establish chronological facts, you don't necessarily need to get into esotericism stuff. But if you want to understand and appreciate Evola, Guénon, any of the other traditionalist thinkers who do have a very heavy metaphysical basis to their approach, then it's really foundational to just fully being able to appreciate and understand that. So go ahead.
Oh, don't ask you. Is there, based on your time in the scene, because you've been making content for quite some time now, on that topic, are there any top things that you think people get wrong on that front? Like, do they get wrong about the idea of esotericism, or when they talk about tradition or Evola? Is there misconceptions that people generally have?
Yeah, so tradition comes from the Latin word tradere, which means to transmit. So this can get used in a lot of different ways, some of which are quite profane and banal, like, this lowercase t traditionalism that really just focuses on historical customs and ancestry. It's like, oh, well, we have to live the way our ancestors did and dress the way our ancestors dressed and believe what they believed. And that's, there's not anything wrong with that, but this isn't really what Evola means when he's talking about tradition. So you also have other uses where the type of tradition, for example, the Kabbalah, which literally means transmission, as an esoteric and metaphysical teaching that then corresponds to some particular tradition. So in the case of the Kabbalah, it's the transmission of the Jewish esoteric tradition. And this is more the type of tradition that Evola is dealing with, this esoteric metaphysical teaching that's being transmitted through this sort of initiatic line. And there's two aspects of traditionalism to consider in this respect. So one is associated with the sort of like metaphysics and morphology of civilizations, and then the other is its more esoteric interpretation. And so when it comes to this historical plane, that is like the things on the timeline of this physical earth, Evola says that tradition is traced back to what he calls immanent transcendence. And this is the idea that there's some supernatural force, from above, some heavenly divine force that's at work in this or that historical period or cycle. And then these periods tend to be characterized by an axis that's composed of these spiritual and super individual values. And this axis becomes the organizational reference point to the overall formation of all the different types of human activity within a given civilization. So what he's saying is that there's a force, a supernatural force that is being transmitted in these cases. This is the transmission, something eternal that is weaving its way through, and that's outside of any of these historical contingencies, on the linear timeline. It's outside of that. It's eternal. And this force is tradition, this eternal, unchanging metaphysical expression that sometimes filters into our world in this more or less accurate way. So then to go back to immanent transcendence, this force is traditionally embodied by the sovereign, by the sacred king, the Chakravartin. And this gives him a spiritual authority that is the foundation of his earthly power. He's the pontifex. He's the bridge between heaven and earth. I have a whole episode in the Revolt Against the Modern World series, actually multiple episodes that deal with this subject. So this king would be the embodiment of this axis point. He's the vessel for it. And this is passed down through blood or initiatic chains or whatever in order to preserve it, because once it's lost, you don't really ever get it back except through like some miracle of the cosmos. So that's how we understand tradition just on the historical plane within the framework of Evola. And then for the esoteric plane, Evola steers us more towards this doctrinal level and this sort of hidden and transcendent unity within various religions and traditions. Frithjof Schuon, another traditionalist, even has a book called, I think, The Transcendent Unity of Religions. And so in Revolt Against the Modern World, in the foreword, when he's talking about how he's going to approach his exposition of the world of tradition, he says he relies on the traditional method, which means that he's looking for a correspondence in symbols, forms, myths, dogmas, practices, etc., beyond their particular expression in a given tradition. It's not about what it means for this particular culture, but what is the unity of the meaning behind all of these different similar stories and symbols, for example. Like, what does the myth of the sun god mean in one culture versus another, and so on? And is there a unity behind all the cultural and historic components that have then been grafted onto these historical expressions of tradition? So, yeah, a certain esotericism is definitely required to fully understand and appreciate the world of tradition and Evola. But there's a kind of a caveat, because he does also say that this isn't just some sort of empirical comparative study of religions. He says you can only undertake this sort of examination of traditional material if you have a spiritual intuition, which is not just some kind of like hunch or instinct. It's more akin to like nous, divine, like the divine intelligence, and then the capacity of the mind to just immediately be able to apprehend knowledge, to just know it in your soul that it's true, because this symbol, for example, is representative of something dharmic, and your soul is aligned with dharma, and so it resonates as true. I don't know how else to explain it, really, but
No, that's a
as
good point. And I wanted to say, one thing I've noticed as I've been reading throughout history is the way you described it sounds very reasonable. Arguably, he'd probably hate me saying this, but scientific in the sense that he's taking a wide scope and treating the data seriously. However, my reading of history, I've detected historians have a hostility towards this sort of thinking, this sort of esotericism, studying, taking the symbols seriously and finding patterns. Do you think there is still a hostility towards this sort of thinking?
Yes, even among, you have people like Jordan Peterson, for example, who talks a lot about this stuff, but he even has, maybe an unconscious hostility towards this, because they're always coming at it from a very modern framework. So, you're not going to find this rare spiritual intuition among, like, dilettantes who are just kind of flirting with the idea of traditionalism as an intellectual novelty, something that their brain just likes to chew on and for curiosity's sake. And they're not like these Jungian Jordan Peterson types who like to play with myths and symbols as if they were toys, but never get into the real meat of it. And spiritual intuition kind of prevents one from running away with their imagination too. That's very easy to do if you're dealing with myths and symbols. And then some people who, maybe are lacking in discernment, you'll find this a lot with, for example, some of the Atlantis crowd. They kind of just start imagining they're seeing these symbolic elements everywhere, even where they can't truly be said to be traditional. Like, for example, in the context of primitive cultures who may have some similarities in their outward symbols and forms, but the core of it, the metaphysical meaning behind it, is often very different. And so you really have to be able to get deep into that root of it and figure out, is this a route that goes to heaven or a route that goes down into the abyss?
Now that's a great point, and this reminds me of a video I saw of yours. The name escapes me, but it was a fairly recent one, and you were discussing, and I might butcher it. So if you know what I'm talking about, try and jump in because I think it's fascinating. The idea that your soul is almost looking for patterns, and if you have a hunger for patterns, you'll find them, and you almost will find this. We might call it like hyper real, but another word like fake divinity because you just crave to find divinity, but you haven't put the work in to actually struggle to find it. Does that
Oh,
sound?
yeah. I think what you must be referring to is the one I did on the law of beings from Intro
Yes,
to
yes, yes,
Magic.
yes. That's
And
it.
he was talking about how if there's any part of your soul that wishes this, kind of transcendent experience that you're having, if you're wishing this to be true in some way or another, you'll almost get the experience you're wishing for, but it's not necessarily true. You have to.
And you
He's
mentioned
basically
drugs as
talking about,
well.
yeah, like, for example, people feel like if they take acid or ayahuasca or something, they feel enlightened, like they've been let in on the secrets of the universe. Well, maybe you have, but maybe the secrets that were revealed to you are just your own deepest inner yearnings. How do you differentiate between those two? And these the people who are pursuing spirituality solely on that pathway with no doctrinal foundation to support them end up making this mistake quite frequently.
And that's a great point. And just to draw a connection that he might not want me to draw, but I think it's relevant, is you see something even in Christianity and Catholicism with the concept of the Antichrist. You know, here is a negation, a dark figure who's here as a corrupting force, but offers you everything you're looking for. It fulfills your deepest desires, and that can create the false sense of it's fulfilling your wishes. And they use that word wish, and that's why I like coming back to it, almost like a
Yeah.
genie, but you haven't put the work in. It's almost too easy, you know?
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I used to have a friend whose motto was sloth wins. And this has stuck in my head for years because it's so true, right? Especially in the modern world. Sloth wins. Why would you put in more effort when you think that you can get what you want with less effort? I mean, isn't dropping some acid more fun than sitting in meditation for hours on end? I think most people would agree that it is, but it's not necessarily the pathway to true enlightenment. It's just, in some ways, it's almost a sort of spiritual hedonism. And that's not to say that you couldn't get any benefit out of using that as a tool. I'm not like trying to knock people who do that or anything, or say that all their experiences are invalid, because I don't know. I don't have any framework for knowing the contents of somebody's mind and soul. I barely know my own, right? So but it's a warning that he's giving, right? That, this is part of the reason with initiation, where you had to have like a mind that was free of attachments before you could pursue initiation, because you need to be operating in the world in a non-attached way. Otherwise you end up being sucked back in by the illusion of this world through your cravings, right? You'll
Yeah.
always see what you crave, so you need to kind of purge that within yourself before you're ready to be able to assess what is or is not true on a supernatural level.
Yeah, and that leads into one thing that I really had at the top of my list to talk about, because I think I'd heard you mention this when you were speaking with Academic Agent, who also hosts. He has a series of videos called Evola Day. So if anyone wants to check that out, they can as well on Academic Agent's channel. You were on there,
Yeah.
but you were talking about the importance of self initiation, and I heard that. And I thought that was such an interesting idea. I was wondering if you could maybe delve a bit into self initiation, I guess in the path of true enlightenment, just for people who don't know what that might entail.
Yeah. Okay. So Evola's premise is kind of that self initiation is really the only path in the modern world because all existing traditions are corrupted. So it's an important concept in the context of this Kali Yuga, when we have these initiatic chains that have been broken or corrupted, because it used to be that if you went through an initiation, if done correctly, it would produce an ontological change in your nature due to having established a contact within yourself with the divine. So you have achieved a high level of self mastery and self transformation, but this can only come from within. So external rituals and ceremonies are kind of, they're representative of the inner transformation that has to take place, but they don't produce that transformation in and of themselves. And so that's what a lot of modern, spiritual initiations have become, is just sort of empty shell. And it's, you go through the process, and you're promised the fruits, but you don't get them because something's broken in that chain. And so Evel is saying, self-initiation is, a possible alternative. But I wouldn't say that it's crucial for the individual to pursue this. In fact, I would probably say that the vast majority of people should not. And that's because initiation of any kind always assumed certain prerequisites. And chief among them is the total mastery of the mind, the ability to sit in still and peaceful meditation, essentially, to have total control over the urges and desires of your bodies, to direct your mind with laser focus to where you want it to go and nowhere else. Like if you just sit, and I've had people do this exercise on streams before, like if you just like kind of just sit and close your eyes and try to just focus on your breath, just the sensation of the air moving in and out of your nostrils across your upper lip, and you try to focus on that, you'll get maybe about 2 to 3 breaths tops before some other thought is running through your mind. And like, to imagine like how out of control of your own mind you have to be that you cannot even get it to focus on something for a couple of seconds. It should be so easy in principle, right? Why do we have trouble with this? So you have to instead, first, before you can even think about self-initiation, focus on getting yourself to have that total mastery of mind and body. Your first step should be getting yourself to like a Vipassana retreat or something where you can learn how to do that kind of meditation, for example. And anyone who's not really willing to put in the prerequisite work to do that would not be considered a suitable candidate for initiation. And then self-initiation, any attempts at that would, at worst go disastrously wrong, or at best just be ineffective and you've wasted your time, essentially.
And a lot of this went without saying. Even in my familiarity with like Orthodox Christianity, it used to be much more difficult to be a Christian, and these rituals were more strictly adhered to, especially in Catholicism. But now you look around, and really, even within the Catholic Church, it seems to be, the rituals are soulless and they're very laissez-faire about adhering to the rituals themselves, much less any sort of behavior. And I think when I'd read Revolt Against the Modern World, I think I paired it with Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West. And there's actually a lot of commonalities between the book I wasn't suspecting. So when I say that, because there's one concept that I think was Evola, or it could have been Spengler. I always get them mixed up, but it was the concept of, I guess, spiritual inversion. And it was this idea that as we progress through time, concepts and initiations and rituals don't become destroyed, they become inverted, meaning they're still technically there, but they almost serve the exact negative purpose. They serve to destroy. One example from the realm of politics would be, in America, there's the concept of freedom. And traditionally, the concept of freedom was much more different than our concept of freedom now. We still use the word freedom. We still look at the Constitution, and it's still the same sort of words. It's just we interpret it 180 degrees differently. So now, whereas freedom might have been freedom to action, now freedom almost exclusively means freedom to articulate debauchery and self-destruction. And that only occurred through sort of an inversion of the spirit. And I think an interesting thing you were kind of getting at there was, I think that inversion of the spirit can happen very easily without that sort of proper initiation. They're still doing the rituals, and you don't even know that they're used for corrupting purposes now, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, a big part of it is just the fact that it's completely soulless. So, for example, like one example that I think is probably accessible to most people, at least listeners of your show and mine, if you consider like Plato, for example, and what Plato was articulating in the Republic as like the ideal and just society. Well, one thing that people criticize Plato for is saying that, oh, he's basically a communist. What he's advocating for is communism. And then you look at modern day communism and you think, well, that's pretty horrible. Was Plato a bad guy? No, the difference is that Plato's was rooted in tradition. It was rooted in the divine. And he's expressing, he's not necessarily saying that this is what society should be. This is kind of a thought experiment, really. And so if you take those ideas and you divorce them from their metaphysical foundation, then you get communism, because now it's only attached to the material world, and anything that you take and separate from its divine principles and attach it solely to the material is going to undergo a process of degradation, and its value changes significantly. And this is true of, like, for example, all sacred sciences. Things like astrology, for example, that were once, okay, you're looking at the heavens and you're tracking the movements of the planets, but it's pinned to a metaphysical and spiritual framework that's meant to help you on your transcendent quest. Now we just have astronomy, and they're just like, how much diversity can we put on the moon? And it's like, like, why though? Why are we doing this? What value does it have to us as people? Oh, well, material and technological progress. It's always progress, right? And that's just not the goal of traditional ideas.
You mentioned something there. You mentioned astronomy, and it just piqued my interest. What's your opinion on modern astrology? Because to a lot of people, the uninitiated, they would look at astrology as approaching something esoteric, sort of a pop esotericism. And I was wondering, what's your opinion on astrology? Do you like it? Do you hate it? Or was it good before and now it's corrupted, inverted? What's your feeling there?
Well, I don't know if you know this, but I'm actually a professional astrologer.
I did not. Okay, we're leaving.
So I might be a little
Guess what?
biased.
You know what? We're leaving that in. I just showed my ass, but it's worth it. Okay, so
It's okay. It's not like something I like heavily publicize or anything, but it's funny that you ask.
no, but okay. So as even though you have your bias, your expertise from the inside, what can you tell us about astrology? Because as just a guy that's never been on my radar, and that always seemed like, oh, that's a girls watch Friends, that's their thing. But you're a very serious person, you're a very knowledgeable person, and I'm willing to admit that I'm wrong. So, do you think there's a lot of bad astrology out there, for example?
Oh, for sure. So if you take like astrology as a pure sacred science and what it was originally intended to be, you get two pathways of breakdown for this. One is astronomy, which is purely material. And this is the sort of like kind of the inversion. The form of studying the stars is still there, but the meaning behind it is gone. On the flip side, you get people who want to use it for spiritual purposes but have no doctrinal basis for doing so, and then you get like new agey types of modern astrology, which I think is what everybody hates when they hate on astrology, because that's largely what people know through newspaper horoscopes or just like the TV psychics that you would call the 900 number for or whatever. And it's easy to look at those people and be like, well, clearly they're frauds, they're cons, like, especially when a lot of them are claiming to be psychic and to use that in their astrology, which is not part of astrology at all. It's not a psychic thing. Anyone can learn how to do this. It's a method. That's all it is. It's a method, and there are delineation techniques that can help you to understand your transcendent quest and put you in touch with the gods, for example. So my view of astrology is obviously very favorable, but I will say that I only started studying it and practicing it very seriously because of my interest in Evola and other topics like that, because all of these esoteric works are very replete with astrological symbolism. And I was kind of getting to the point where I was like, I really need to know more about this subject if I'm going to go deeper with any of this. And so, I took my courses on like my fifth year of courses now. So
Oh, really? Serious
yeah.
stuff. Well, because again, I don't much about this, and one thing that as you're talking, what I found so fascinating is that you seem to have a practical experience with this stuff. It's not just theoretical. And I was wondering, along with astrology, but you had mentioned before you'd spoken to people on your show and did the meditation thing and saw the problems that occurred there. I was wondering, in your professional experience, for other people who've tried to get into this stuff, are there any common roadblocks, like for like the meditation thing you're talking about, or just where people go wrong trying to wrap their minds around this stuff?
um what do you mean in terms of the meditation thing? I'm
Oh,
not sure I'm
that.
totally
Well, I just
understanding the question.
you seemed like with astrology, you kind of you coach people, you talk to people about this stuff, and for someone like me, like for example, who wants to, let's say, I wanted to embrace a traditionalist outlook, because to me, to truly embrace like a Vola style tradition, you almost have to rework your mind on a
Oh
molecular
yeah.
level. So for people, and we probably wouldn't recommend most people would do that, but for the people who do want to go down this path, I was wondering if you've seen any difficulties they have sort of trying to engage with these ideas.
Yeah, the biggest difficulty is just that it's so foreign to the modern mindset. As you say, like it requires a total paradigm shift essentially. And so what people come up against is, first they try to engage with these ideas just empirically. And these ideas are not always easily reduced to discursive thought. it does often come down to the spiritual intuition that Evola talks about, the ability to just feel it in your soul is true and to know. You just like, it's an inner knowing, and this becomes an orienting, guiding principle for you around which you can center the rest of your life. It becomes your own inner stable axis, like the king is supposed to function as in the empire. You develop that inside. So, in order to try to start engaging with these ideas, you have to put aside almost everything you believe is true about the world and how it works. Everything in the Kali Yuga is everything you've been taught is probably wrong, or it's only true in the most profane sense, for example. And
And
this is difficult for a lot of people to do,
I was going to
especially with
say,
no guidance for it.
yeah, but before we continue, I know some people, we discussed this on the show before about the Kali Yuga, but for those who are confused by it, and maybe you could do a better job of explaining what the Kali Yuga refers to.
Yeah, so this is actually a really important doctrinal concept within tradition, and it's the cycle of time, cyclical time, the cycle of these four ages. So the golden age, the silver age, the bronze age, the iron age. And I don't mean like the historical bronze age or anything. It's just like, consider it like the third age in the cycle. And so the idea is that time is not linear in the way that modern people think it is, where there's a definite beginning and a definite end. The universe was created and then the universe ends and that's it. So all of these eternal things, creation, for example, is not just one singular point. It is a singular point, yes, but it's also happening over and over again. The universe is continuously unfolding. Purusha continuously glances at Prakriti, and creation is expanded and contracted. And these things exist eternally. How can we as human beings really conceptualize that with our limited minds in a modern paradigm? We can't really. Our brains aren't wired for that. And so that's where that internal knowing comes from, because it's not something you can just explain with words. You almost have to just have, like, for me, it kind of comes in like just a picture in my mind almost, but not even like a picture. Sometimes it's more of like, it could be a picture, but it's more of a feeling or a vibe of some kind. Like, I can't even describe like what it looks like or feels like to me when I have those moments. And so imagine for Evola trying to write a book on this stuff and explain it to people. This is why he's such a dense writer, because he's trying to pin down these ideas in ways. He's like, all right, I'm just going to give you like a bazillion examples and hope that one of them resonates with you almost.
Yeah.
But back to, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just agreeing with you. Sorry, continue.
Yeah. So back to your question about like, well, what is the Kali Yuga? Well, the Kali Yuga is the last age. It's the Iron Age. It's the Dark Age, the Age of the Wolf. We are at the end of a cycle in this age, but the Kali Yuga is really just beginning, because it's like hundreds of thousands of years long,
Yeah.
unfortunately. You think it's bad now? We're going to get to a place where people are raising babies for food, according to the Vedas.
Oh, okay. So, are there any other examples from the Vedas? And for people who are curious, we had covered some of this stuff when we reviewed a book called Arctos by Jocelyn Godwin. This would have been a few months and months ago, but we talk a bit about Hyperborea. We talk a bit about the cycles, but I never went deep into the Indo-European source material. And I was wondering, you kind of talked about the eating your babies according to that one source. Do you have any other bad stuff to look forward to?
Yeah, well, let me read you this section that Evola quotes at the end of Revolt. He has the appendix on the Dark Age. It's just a couple of pages that he's taking a quote from the Vishnu Purana that will describe some of the features of the Kali Yuga. He says, outcasts and barbarians will be masters of the banks of the Indus, Darvika and Chandrabhaga and Kashmir. These will all be contemporary rulers of this age, reigning over the earth, rulers of violent temper. They will seize upon the property of their subjects. They will be of limited power and will, for the most part, rapidly rise and fall. Their lives will be short, their desires insatiable, and they will display but little piety. The people of various countries intermingling with them will follow their example. The prevailing caste will be the Shudra, the lowest caste, the people who have no initiatic rights, so essentially the plebs. Vaishyas, this is the artisan class and the agricultural class, Vaishyas will abandon agriculture and commerce and gain a livelihood by servitude or the exercise of mechanical arts, which he refers to as proletarization and industrialization. The Kshatriyas, the warrior caste, instead of protecting, will plunder their subjects and, under the pretext of levying customs, will rob merchants of their property. And in brackets, Evola puts crisis of capitalism and private property, socialization, nationalization, and communism. He goes on. Inner wealth and piety, such in this case following one's dharma, will decrease day by day until the whole world will be wholly depraved. Then property alone will confer rank, and as in, the quantity of dollars, your economic class. Material wealth will be the only source of devotion. Passion will be the sole bond of union between the sexes. Falsehood will be the only means of success in litigation. Earth will be venerated, but for its mineral treasures. And he puts in brackets unscrupulous exploitation of the soil, demise of the cult of the earth. Brahminical clothes will constitute a Brahmin, so a priest is only a priest because he's dressed like one. Weakness will be the cause of dependence, and he puts cowardice, death of fides, and honor in the modern political forms. Simple ablution, devoid of the power of the true right, will be purification. And he says, can there really be anything more in the alleged salvation procured by the Christian sacraments? He says, in the Kali Yuga, men are corrupted by unbelievers. They will say, of what authority are the Vedas? What are gods or Brahmins? Observance of caste, order, and institutes will not prevail in the Kali age. Marriages in this age will not be conformable to ritual, nor will the rules that connect the spiritual preceptor and his disciple be in force. A regenerated man will be initiated in any way whatever, so democracy applied to the spiritual plane. And such acts of penance may be performed will be unattended by any results. So a humanistic and conformist religion is what he's referring to. All orders of life will be common alike to all persons. He who gives away much money will be the master of men, and family descent will no longer be a title of supremacy. So we see the end of traditional nobility, the advent of the bourgeoisie, plutocracy, etc. Men will fix their desires upon riches, even though dishonestly acquired. Men of all degrees will conceit themselves to be equal with the Brahmins, which is actually really funny because if you've ever seen like people on Twitter or Telegram where they post these polls like what caste do you think you are, and like the vast majority of people imagine themselves to be of the priest or warrior caste, and of course in this age we are all shudras. I hate to disappoint you.
Yeah.
But the people will almost always be in dread of dearth and apprehensive of scarcity, and will hence ever be watching the appearances of the sky. So he's talking not about astrology in the way that I use it, but the superstitious beliefs, for example, any kind of religious superstition. The women will pay no attention to the commands of their husbands or parents. They will be selfish, abject, and slatternly. They will be scolds and liars. They will be indecent and immoral in their conduct and will ever attach themselves to dissolute men. Men having deviated into heresy, iniquity will flourish, and the duration of life will therefore decrease. So it's not sounding real pleasant, is it?
Well, it sounds very familiar to a lot of people, I'm sure.
It and isn't it a little bit concerning that we're only this early in the Kali Yuga and we're already seeing these things in full force?
Yeah, I never heard described like because I understood the Kali Yuga like it's bad things, but I never heard it laid out like that. But you actually touched on a lot of very interesting ideas there. Specifically, the one that jumps out at me was the people in our political milieu voting themselves as everyone's a priest warrior class. Yeah, yeah, like I haven't seen that poll, but knowing the types of guys that I've talked to, everyone sees themselves as a warrior priest, right? But
Yeah.
maybe consider that. I want to unpack that for a second because I get the sense from reading these sort of perennialist ideas. And for the people who don't know, by perennialist, we tend to mean things that are true. They're not just of their time; they're true across time. You know, like a perennial plant. You know, it keeps coming back. But there, when I look in the traditional way of life, I see a more interesting balancing of individuality with hierarchy. And when I see people who are constantly voting themselves, for example, like we just talked about, into a hypothetical higher caste, that's mainly a reaction. That's because they see themselves socially as above everyone else. But that's almost like an inverted conceptualization of how a hierarchy or a caste actually works. So anyway, I'm kind of rambling here, but I wanted to know, like, in your opinion, in this traditionalist worldview, for example, like when people in our political scene, they tend to think in terms of individualism versus collectivism. It's only those two. And a lot of the people in our scene would say collectivism is superior and individualism rots the mind. However, with traditionalism, I see more of an affirmation of individualism in a different sort of way, while also balancing the need of the hierarchy. And I'm wondering, does that seem accurate? Is that a fair thing to say, that it's a balancing of individual with a really codified hierarchy and not any sort of like collectivist ideas, really?
Yeah, so like for example, within a caste system, you kind of have, you're almost selecting for specific traits within a caste, and those traits then tend to predominate. But of course, you always have somebody who's, a bit unique or individual or something. And it's not that you need to squash that within you that is unique and individual, so much as that it needs to still fit into your role in society, your dharma. And so the kind of individuation that we're talking about, traditionally speaking, is not the individuation of modern man where it's just all about, like, I don't know, going traveling to find yourself or whatever that means, and developing like this, quote unquote personality. There is something, this individuation that Evola is aiming for is an individuation that is beyond the individual. It's a supra individual state. And this is not the same thing as, the person traveling around trying to find themselves. This is somebody who's achieved like an Olympian leap and really realized their highest divine potential. That is not what you're looking for when you're going around trying to figure out your personality and whatever mask you wear in society.
Now, I'm wondering, would, I'm pulling examples out here, but when we look at, monks, when we look at people who commit themselves to meditation, perhaps in Buddhism, would that be an example of people who are trying to achieve that super individuality, or is that just something entirely? And that's just like a monk class thing?
It depends on what they're doing. There's a lot of different types of meditation, and not all of them are intended to lead towards like that full realization of the higher self.
Okay.
But a lot of them are. If you're seeing like monks in a temple, then most likely they're, at least attempting to attain that higher realization. But some of like this modern Western mindfulness meditation is not that. And it's not that that kind of meditation is wrong or unhelpful or anything. You can still do it and get benefits from it. It's just not going to. It's just not going to liberate the higher self.
Well, that's a great example of sort of a bad way of doing it. And it makes me wonder, we were just talking about castes, and when people hear a caste system, what they're probably thinking of is India. And they would hear that, oh, India has a caste system. And they'll hear that in a geopolitical sense, that caste system equals slavery equals bad. And I was wondering, from your perspective, and this might be a big question, so you can tell me to go fuck myself, but would India's caste system, in your opinion, be a good example of what we're talking about, or has that become sort of corrupted with time, do you think?
Obviously, it's corrupted and degraded in the modern world because these castes do not all still retain their inner spiritual quality. Like, as Evola says, we're in this age, we're all Shudras. So, but from a theoretical standpoint, the caste system is very traditionalist, and the reason for this is that so tradition essentially, it finds its concrete expression in symbols, sacraments, rituals, and its aim is to develop in man that faculty or vocation which puts him in contact with the transcendent in the highest degree possible relative to his character and caste. So caste systems sort of reflect a hierarchy between these various categories of people based not on like physical characteristics, which a lot of modern people are like, oh, the caste system's so racist because it puts the darker skinned people at the bottom and the lighter skinned people at the top and so on. It's like, it's not about the race of the body. It's about their relative degree of distance from pure being or pure spirit. And people are not equal in their spiritual potential or in their social capacity. So different people have different talents and responsibilities, and a caste system ensures that each individual is able to fulfill their dharma, to sort of fully blossom into their full potential as a human being, and to be able to fulfill their spiritual destiny and contribute, I guess, to the greater good in a way that's meaningful and appropriate. But the modern objection is like, well, I wouldn't want to have to be in that caste. I don't want to have to be the bricklayer. It's like, well, it's not about what you want. It's about fulfilling your dharma. And if that doing that was easy, there's no heroic overcoming contained within that. If following God's will also means following yours, how difficult is that? How have you done anything to overcome your base nature? You haven't. You've done nothing. You're just indulging in it. So, sometimes in order to fulfill our dharma, we're called to do things that are not necessarily the things that are like the most fun or the most pleasant. But if we approach it with the right attitude, then it can become a liberating force. And so, and what people want to do is just so often at odds with spiritual growth. It's more aligned with pursuing material delights. And modern people hate this idea that, you need to subsume your will into God's will and put God's will first and simply be a tool through which God carries out his will. Your will doesn't matter. Modern people do not like to hear this. This really upsets them. But that's essentially what the caste system is designed to protect. It's not a chain. It's a support. It's something to help you grow on your transcendent quest. Now, it may contain some constraints in terms of your quote unquote freedom, which, as you mentioned, it no longer has the same meaning, because nowadays freedom just means licentiousness. A caste system was designed to give you true freedom, to help you be free of the bonds of materiality. So, and this hierarchy isn't some invention of humans. It's a natural part of the cosmos, much in the way that, did you ever do like that science experiment in elementary school where you mix like oil and water and then they separate and one floats on top of the other?
Yes, we did. Yeah.
It's kind of like that. The lighter fluid floats on top of the denser ones. And so it's just the hierarchy is just this sort of impersonal cosmic law. It's not suggesting that one type is better than any other, because all of them are necessary. And a person of a lower caste who fulfills their role perfectly is always superior to anyone of an upper caste who is failing to fulfill theirs. So one is then born into a specific caste simply because one possesses like a transcendentally different spirit than somebody of another caste. So birth doesn't determine your nature. Your nature, the nature of your soul, determines your birth. In a sense, this is the life that you got, the body that you got, the family that you got, the caste that you got, because there is something about your soul that is appropriate to this situation. Now, of course, in the Kali Yuga, all of this has broken down, and everybody's, people are being born into the wrong caste. Some people claim they're born into the wrong gender. I don't know, maybe they are. But in any case, there's a disharmony. We're living in disharmony. And so we get, mental and physical and spiritual illnesses that can result from living like that, because we're not aligned with Dharma, and our society is giving us this freedom to pursue our material desires, but it's really limiting us in our ability to reach our full spiritual potential.
I know this will sound like a very basic bitch question, but I'm not terribly familiar with the concept of Dharma. Would there be a way to summarize that for people who might have that confused with karma or anything, any kind of vagueness like that?
Yeah, so karma and dharma are two different words. Dharma is essentially like just the underlying principle or law that orders the universe,
Okay.
or the essential function or nature of a being. And sometimes you'll hear it used in terms of like how an individual might conduct themselves in conformity, with dharmic principles. So it's a Sanskrit word that really does not have a direct translation into English. But it's related to, I don't know if you're familiar with any Sanskrit, but Rita, this very old Sanskrit word, which kind of refers to, is essentially like the law from above. Dharma is very closely related to that. Karma, on the other hand, is a different concept entirely, and karma does play a role in, for example, caste. Karma is essentially this cause and effect principle. It's a cosmic law. It's not a punishment or anything like that. It's just simply, if this action is taken, this karma is accrued. Here's the consequence. It could be a positive or negative consequence. So, for example, if I'm, being lazy and I decide not to go do my grocery shopping, well, my karma is that I don't get dinner that night,
Yeah.
because so it's and so our souls are, the product of karma, the totality of actions and conduct that may have been ours or may have been the result of something that somebody else did. It's not like this closed thing where it's only your actions that affect your soul, but other people can do stuff to you too. Like if I loan my friend money and he doesn't pay me back, well, I'm out $100. And that's not necessarily because of anything I did wrong, but because my friend chose to be dishonest, right? Now you could say, well, you shouldn't have loaned him the money. It's like, well, there's karma again, right? So it does take its way back, but ultimately the karma that you have is going to somewhat determine your birth. And this is one thing that people ask me a lot about when they come for astrological readings, because your natal chart is essentially a picture of your karma. Here's your natal karma. This is what you were born with, and these are the themes you're going to live with for your life that are going to come up for you again and again. And how do you make your peace with that? And that's what we're called to do. We're called to kind of make our peace with our karma, really.
Well, that's interesting. And that's something that, like we had mentioned, we don't see a lot of people in the modern world engage with. And I see echoes of this even in the political spheres that I would travel in. And as you're describing the function of a caste, I'm reminded of some people that I talked to recently who are like, a good example would be there's like blue collar workers, and they're usually born into that. And it's very difficult for a blue collar worker to become an elite. And on the other hand, the elites, the aristocrats in society, they tend to come from a certain pedigree. It's very frequent that you will see sort of the elites, they come from elite families. They are trained from birth to go to the right private schools and the right schools. It's not just the schools you get into, it's how you're raised, it's the entire environment and the family connections. And usually, even occasionally, when you do see someone ascend from a lower, let's just call it what it is, a caste, into a different one, it doesn't fit, it doesn't gel. They're just a disruptive force, but they don't fit in. Similarly, it's very difficult for the elites to go down into a working man's class. And I find what's interesting, the reason I bring this up, is that not only does that incongruity exist, but a lot of the working class blue collar people, they got no interest in what's going on with the elites. They think it's stupid and useless. And that to me is not a bad thing necessarily. And I know a lot of people who are kind of in like the middle class who aspire to be in the aristocrat class, and they're not there. And they'll probably never get there because they weren't raised into it. They're not of that class. And even if they found their way into those back rooms, they would get sniffed out right away. And just this
Well,
is
like
just to say
Meghan
that,
Markle.
yeah, and this is just an example to see that despite we're not talking about just crazy kooky esoteric stuff, this is evident in the real world right now, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So, like if you look at the damage and havoc that Meghan Markle wreaked on the royal family, for example, she's not of that class. Not only was she not born in that class, she's not even from that country, and she had no clue about the kind of aristocratic culture that she was marrying into. She thought she wanted to be a princess, I guess, but turns out she's not really suited for it. Compare that to Kate Middleton, who, while not strictly speaking nobility, was raised in a moneyed family. And she went to, the schools and the universities that the elite kids did, and she was somewhat part of that world. She fits into her role much better. Some of that's probably a personality thing too, but Uh, it is interesting. It's been an interesting like little fallout to watch. And I'm not like some big fan of the British royal family or anything like that, but it's an interesting case study as to what happens when you sort of drop somebody of a lower class into a higher one, and it just really doesn't ever seem to work out.
Yeah, and I know my co-host who couldn't be here today. He would laugh about showing up to the job site with new tools. There's nothing worse than showing up to a bunch of guys on a construction site who've been working their whole life, and you have like brand new tools, and you're not of them. You're not the guy who's got worn out tools, and you will get essentially lynched if you're too fancy. So they detect a stink on you that you shouldn't be there, that you don't have the same values, the well treaded shoes that they've got. And anyway, I like that because I see that everywhere now that I think of it. I had another question for you based on just some of the stuff we were just talking about. We're talking about how people could achieve, this super individuality, achieve this enlightenment and transcendence. And I wonder, considering that we are in the Kali Yuga and it's cyclical, um, does it make sense for someone to even try and achieve that, or does it make sense to just ride it out? Is it because our surroundings and environment are so corrupted and so inverted? Could we even recommend the average person to break off from that, or is it just, is it too hard? Is it not even worth it? What do you think?
Okay, maybe before I answer that, I should clarify the Kali Yuga a little bit better so that people understand the principles that are at work and why we have a Kali Yuga in the first place. So, the basic idea with these four ages, the golden age is our state of unity. It's before the fall. There's no dyad, there's no male, female, it's a state of being. And post fall, we then have the introduction of the dyad. Now things are split into masculine and feminine. This is one of the Hermetic laws. Everything has gender, absolutely everything. And this applies to the four ages. So the golden age is the age in which the masculine principle, Shiva, predominates. Um, and as we go through the successive ages, we see the feminine beginning to take precedence until we reach the nadir of the Kali Yuga, in which Shiva is almost totally asleep. The masculine principle has retreated from the world. We are totally under the aegis of the feminine being related to chaos and becoming and flux. And this is why we see the problems that we see in this world. This is a necessary part of the cycle. And this is like the Hermetic great work on a cosmic level. At the end of the Kali Yuga, we hope Shiva will be able to suddenly and violently react against himself, wake himself up essentially to trigger the next golden age. And in Hermeticism, this has corollaries with what's called the white work and the red work. This also has links to things like sex magic. So the white work is when the masculine principle becomes totally subsumed by the feminine. And through an alchemical reaction within a man or within the cosmos, that masculine kind of realizes like at the last moment, hey, like I'm about to drown in the abyss here if I don't get my act together and stop like just indulging in the sensory pleasures of the feminine. And then there's just this sudden jolt. And at this point, the corrosive waters of the feminine are converted into the waters of life. The masculine and the feminine can achieve a state of unity again. And this begins the red work. And the red work is when the feminine is subsumed into the masculine and reduced to the nature of the masculine. Now we have a new golden age. And this dynamic underlies everything from the Yuga cycle down to our interpersonal relationships as men and women. It rules everything. So in the Kali Yuga, we are in this stage where the masculine is almost totally asleep and we need to await the process to complete. And part of being, trying to reach a super individual state, to be a man among the ruins, is to recognize that this cycle is all just part of the play of God. And we may experience that subjectively here on earth as really unpleasant because we're divine beings and we yearn to be in harmony with God. We yearn to be in a state of being, but we're not. So we're not having a great time down here in the Kali Yuga, but God's just doing his thing. This is just how the cosmos moves, right? There's always this interplay. There's always this back and forth between the masculine and the feminine. And so if you want to then achieve, that state where you've sort of transcended the modern world, a certain level of non-attachment is necessary to do this. And so for a lot of people, that does end up coming with less of a desire to engage in the material modern world. And modernity is, of course, it's fundamentally opposed to the world of tradition. So, if you want to create a golden age within yourself, then you have to establish that quality that you would attain in initiation. You need to do the red work within yourself. And that means you need to reject all the values and attitudes of the modern world. And as you do that, you will likely find that you lose the taste for maybe participating in it the way that you once did before. Some people who go through this process choose to withdraw from the world and just focus purely on their spiritual journey, but you don't have to. This is one thing that people do sometimes criticize Evola for because they're misunderstanding it as being like apathetic nihilism of some kind. And that's not what Evola is advocating at all. The alternative and the traditional principle, which is expounded in the Bhagavad Gita, the alternative is you continue to act in the world, but without attachment to outcomes. You're acting with equanimity. You're not being perturbed by the goings on of the world. You're just seeing it as part of this great cosmic play. And if you do choose to act, then you do it with a commitment to duty, to upholding dharma, the law from above, not because you're hoping to attain some particular goal in the material world, which I think this is something that the average dissident right person really struggles with. Right. Because they're very attached to outcomes, aren't they? And they see everything in terms of how do I make this world into my image? And they're very angry about it. And they can't even conceive of taking action without that attachment. Because to them, caring about the world means being attached to it. And that means concerning yourself with outcomes. But to the spiritual person, this is not any contradiction. One can care without being invested. So to kind of conceptualize this and give an analogy, like let me use a cat lady analogy. Like let's say there's a cat lady. Okay, it's me actually. I'm the cat lady. Well, let's say that I come across a starving stray cat, which I often do, and I feel sorry for the cat. I'm moved by compassion as well as by my duty. As a human being, I'm a steward of this earth and of God's creatures. It's my dharmic duty to act with compassion towards all creatures. So I give it food, but I don't concern myself with the cat's fate. I don't try to catch him and make a pet of him in order to save him and give him a better life. I would, of course, prefer to see that he's happy and healthy, but I also know that I can't save every hungry cat in the world. That's beyond my scope. So I act towards that cat in a way that is in line with my values and my duty, but without any attachment to that cat's fate. And it doesn't mean that I don't care about cats or that I won't help cats when I can. It doesn't mean that I don't love that cat because I love them all. But I also can't let myself spiral out emotionally every time I see something in the world that's tragic. And so when you're a spiritual person, you will start to see the whole world this way. You see, there's so much tragedy and suffering. There's so much evil, and you should act against it, but not because you expect or hope to win, but because it's the right thing to do. And you should do it even if a loss is guaranteed, simply because it is your duty as a traditional spiritual person to fight on behalf of Dharma in this world. And this kind of gets into the warrior ethos that Evola talks a lot about. I don't know if you want to really get into that, though.
I would love to, if you're able to. I'd love to.
Yeah. So, okay, this is the warrior ethos is not, everybody's kind of got this conception of the warrior as an angry guy with weapons, I guess. A lot of a lot of people kind of mistake masculinity for basically like this berserker type of guy, right?
Yeah.
And it's not, there's nothing, first of all, there's nothing masculine about being in the grips of your emotions like that. The masculine warrior is the one who's like cold, calculated, and he's not acting out of malice. He has no emotional impulse driving him to act. He is simply acting out of duty in defense of Dharma. This was the whole like code of like the Knights Templar and all the chivalric orders of the Middle Ages, for example. It's the code of the samurai warriors.
And a lot of people might say this reminds them, it doesn't me anyway, of maybe in some way of Stoicism. Now, would that be an accurate comparison?
Yeah, Stoicism is not exactly the same, but it's really similar. And there's definitely like, you can find a lot of really good practices in Stoicism, especially if you're a man. So, for example, in the Muslim tradition, you've probably heard about like the greater and lesser jihad, the inner and outer holy war. So, the lesser jihad is the one you fight on the battlefield. That's the material battle. But the greater jihad is the inner one. You fight against yourself, because within yourself, you find the enemy that is most perfectly suited for you. And war is meant to provide a pathway for heroism. I've talked about this on my channel. The traditional man's path to heroism is the title of the video. And I'm probably going to make a follow-up video on this at some point in the near future. But we're looking for an internal victory, not an external one. We are looking for what's called glory, vreno, vril energy. We are looking for that it factor. And you find this on the battlefield, not because you win the battle, but because of how you fight. You fight without regard for life or limb. If you want that transfiguring heroic experience, you must fight without attachment to anything in this material world. You are not attached to the outcome of the battle. You are not attached to your own life. And this is, this is why in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna is telling Arjuna these things. Arjuna's, I don't know if you're familiar with the Gita. I'll just kind of give a brief overview for any of your listeners.
Please do.
But essentially, the story is that Arjuna he's like one of the greatest warriors to ever live, basically. And he's going into battle against, it's a brother war. He is going to have to kill people who are his family, his cousins, because they are not upholding Dharma. They are bringing evil into the world, and he has to vanquish them. And Krishna, the God, is his charioteer. He's friends with Krishna in his human form. And Krishna's a wise friend, but a very kind friend. And so they reach the battlefield, and Arjuna steps out, and he looks at all of his family on the other side. And he just drops his weapons. And he says, Krishna, I can't do this. I can't fight. I don't want to kill these men. It's too terrible. I can't face this. This is what we're hearing from the greatest warrior ever. Krishna basically has no pity for him at all and says, Arjuna, pick up your weapons and fight, because it is your duty. And as God, I command you to do this. You're of the warrior caste. It is your dharma to fight for righteousness in this world. You must do this, or you experience, like, you suffer the worst shame imaginable, but also you damn your immortal soul, essentially. And Krishna explains to him, like, time just kind of stops on the battlefield while this explanation is taking place. And he has this very long conversation with Arjuna, answering all of his questions about the nature of the universe and the nature of God and what is right and correct action. And Krishna essentially says, I have already decided the fate of these men. I have already decided who wins and who loses. I have decided who lives and who dies. This has nothing to do with you, but I'm giving you this opportunity to go out and fight this battle so that you can have this internal victory, so that you can achieve this for your soul. And these men on the other side also get the same opportunity. So you would see, for example, in the Crusades, the Muslims think they're fighting a holy war. The Templars are fighting a holy war, and they have different things that they're fighting for. They have different beliefs that they're fighting, but ultimately they respect and honor each other on the battlefield, because you are meeting the other person, knowing that they too are fighting their own inner holy war, and that you are both giving each other the opportunity to attain that. And in that sense, a war is a win-win for these warriors if each side is meeting with that mentality, regardless of who wins or loses. But this is so hard for the modern person to understand if you only think in terms of material or political outcomes, for example. It's like, well, why would I fight if I can't win? It's like,
Yeah.
but because you do win. You may lose in the material realm, but you win on the spiritual realm, and that's the important thing.
I'd never really heard it explained like that before. I think that's a total recontextualization for most people about what they mean by warrior. And I liked how you started that too, which is that, our conceptualization of a warrior is this sort of unhinged madman. You made a good point in saying he's overly emotional. Well, that's true. Like someone who embraces unhinged savagery, which is, the almost the exact opposite of what you want to do, because that savage is also very likely to flee if he doesn't get exactly what he wants, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know. You're a man. Maybe you've been in a fight or two in your life. Most of you guys seem to have been.
Yeah.
If you're going up against a fight of somebody, like, who are you more afraid of? Are you afraid of the guy who's shouting really loud, who's a big talker and beating his chest? Or are you afraid of the guy who's sitting there not rattled at all? He's totally calm going into this fight. There is not a flicker of emotion in his eyes. Which one do you think you have a better chance against?
And you see that most evident in high school as well. A lot of guys who've ever gotten into high school fights, I've gotten probably into more fights than I should. But that's why I don't really glorify it, because a lot of people who haven't never gotten into a fight have the wrong idea of what it's like to be in and not like a martial arts sparring situation, but just
Like an
a
actual
fight.
street fight, like
Yeah.
something actually where someone's actually trying to do serious harm to you or even possibly kill you. Like, the person who's angry and making a lot of noise, that person makes a mistake. That's a person that you can get a few hits in on, but the guy who's cold and calculated is not going to make mistakes. You could still win against him, sure, but
One of my,
he's
one of my
he's a bit
favorite quotes
scarier.
One of my favorite quotes was from Mike Tyson, where everyone's got a plan until they get punched in the face.
Yeah.
Uh, but high school is funny because like the big, loud, bellowing guy. You look at him now, I'm like, oh, you were just molested. You're just like a guy who's got a shitty dad. Like, we're not really scared of you as a grown up. You look at that guy, like you're just sort of probably a broken person, but the real dangerous person. And you will see this in high school, especially if you go to kind of a shitty public school like I did. I don't know, maybe this doesn't happen in nice schools, but where I was, there's always fights, and and that doesn't really change in life. But I've also gotten
Yeah.
like I got like beat the shit up by like a short guy too, so my experience might be different than most. But yeah, hey, watch out for short guys. Everyone knows that short guys, they're a mystery, and you don't want to go. You don't want to go into a maze in a daze. That's what I say.
Yeah,
Um,
and so much of fighting is very psychological. So, the guy who's flailing around in anger, it's kind of like, all right, he can do some damage, but like if we all just kind of stand out of the way, he'll burn himself out eventually, right? And part of you is almost laughing at him because he's so out of control. He's so in the grips of his emotions. It's very feminine. But the guy who cannot be rattled emotionally at all, you cannot win the psychological war against him. All you have left then is your physical might. You can't psych him out.
I'm curious. As we talk about this, we talk a lot about the masculine versus the feminine, and I was curious, in your travels, do you see these ideas popular enough with women, or does it tilt more towards men, or what's your feeling there?
In terms of traditional ideas around gender,
About like the masculine versus maybe like the feminine being chaos, and is that sort of track with women you talk to, or is this sort of thinking more popular with men? It's maybe a broad question, but
even among women who call themselves traditional, this is an unpopular view. And part of the reason for this, I think, is that, there's been a lot of bad press against women in recent centuries. Some of it religiously
recent
motivated.
centuries.
Like, well, it's not a recent thing. Like, in some ways, like the feminist movement has done a lot to sort of shift that narrative. But historically speaking, within recorded history, and particularly since Christianity's takeover of Europe, uh, Abrahamism in general, I don't actually want to pin that on Christianity because Islam and Judaism have a lot of the same mentality. But that sort of like patriarchy that the feminists are always railing against, it's like, well, it's a really corrupted patriarchy that actually is not a good expression of what patriarchy is. So I can understand why they don't like it and they don't want to be, they don't want to submit to that kind of patriarchy. And that's the kind of patriarchy we have in the modern world. It's a very corrupted one because, as I said, the masculine principle is asleep. So it's harder for men to presence that quality. It's harder for them to be the stable axis, whereas women are, at their full strength. Like the feminine is in charge right now, but it's like a wheel without an axle, and it spins off into chaos. Now, part of the issue too is words like chaos being used to describe the feminine. A lot of these words relate to things that are subjectively negative experiences for human beings. But again, this is because we're divine beings and we yearn for order. But it's not that these things are inherently bad. It's just the world of becoming is opposed to the world of being. And the world of becoming is inherently feminine. Now, we need these two poles. I was just saying to somebody the other day, imagine music, for example. Music is a well-written piece of music is a beautiful interplay between masculine and feminine elements. That is what you need to produce like a classical masterpiece. But if you have only feminine elements, you get just chaotic noise. It's like listening to a little kid pound on the piano while the other one blows on a kazoo and somebody's banging on pots and pans. And it's like, if you have like multiple kids in your house, you probably know exactly what I'm talking about. That's the sound of the feminine music without the masculine involved. On the other end of the spectrum, the pure masculine is total silence. And total silence is actually really kind of creepy to humans. Like if you ever have complete silence, it's like people can go a bit crazy from that.
Oh, they do. If you do sensory,
even for short times, yeah, sensory deprivation. And so what we then have, we don't want a cacophony, and neither do we want silence. We want music. So we take certain sounds and we impose upon them rules and limits. And this is what the masculine does for the feminine. It takes that chaos, gives it rules in which it can have an intelligent design and a form. And so you get then a beautiful piece of music because, okay, it's following rules of order. There are limits to what we can do. And now we are taking this feminine quality of noise, for example, and ordering it. And this is the whole principle behind intelligent design of the cosmos. Without matter being imbued by spirit, the material world would not exist as we know it. It's just the pure realm of becoming is described as being something actually quite terrifying. It is like a hellish, abyssal flux, constant change and impermanence. You would be so disoriented. And so I think part of the reason that we have, this illusion in the material world that we're living under is almost to protect us from the reality that runs underneath all of it. And so in order to have an ordered cosmos, we have that injection of masculine spirit into it, where it's like, okay, I'm coming in to be the center of the wheel, and now I'm going to make Shakti dance in harmony around Shiva. And it's no longer like spastic twerking all over the place. It's a beautiful ballet. You see the difference.
And what's interesting is, in a lot of ways, this is evident in male-female relationships. For example, me and my wife, if something goes wrong, especially our son was born recently, if something's goes wrong in the relationship, the man tends to want to go and brood in silence. And then the woman will emerge and try and re-engage with the man, re-engage with me, like, okay, what are you thinking? Like, I'm trying to solve it in my mind and stare at a window and ponder. But if you just have that, you just have a quiet psychopath. And then if it's up to my wife, she'll just be rambling on about any old fucking thing with no plan. So, but those two combined create a pairing that can raise this hideous monster called a child. And and I wonder that it seems to me, and I'm sure you've noticed this, that especially in our scene, but I think socially as well, that the concept of masculinity, it defines itself almost as the opposition to femininity. And to be more masculine, you must be, and we see this in political parties right now too, like you must almost be anti-woman. And I think what I find interesting about the traditionalist worldview is it's more of a synthesis between the two, and we see this even in some Abrahamic faiths where like the family is the common denominator of the society, that man plus woman equals household, and that household is the indivisible building block of society. But I worry that even on the more traditional side of things, people still see masculinity as you must be anti-woman. Is that something you've seen in your travels?
I have come across that more times than I can count, to the point that it is exhausting to continue to see it. It never
Yeah.
goes away. Um, but what you're saying is correct. Like, for example, in the example that you gave, where if there's a problem between you and your wife, your impulse is to withdraw. You're like, okay, there's chaos and I need to recenter myself. I need to get back in touch with my own stable axis before I can be that for her. So I need to go and have time to myself to center that. From her perspective, she's like, oh no, he's withdrawing the stable axis and there's chaos and I need that even more right now. And so this is what I think a lot of women don't really like, is this idea that they are dependent on a man for that. And while it is true that you can cultivate that in yourself to some degree as a woman, because none of us is just 100% feminine or 100% masculine. Like, you couldn't exist materially in this world if that were the case. But, like the most feminine woman could be like 95% feminine and 5% masculine. But most modern women and modern men are approaching closer and closer to 50-50. Evola writes about this in The Bow and the Club, about this sort of androgyny that's emerging and how the differentiation between the sexes is less and less as the Kali Yuga wears on. But fundamentally speaking, woman relies on man to provide that stability for her. And when a man does that, she's of course happy to submit in a higher sense. I don't mean the kind of like being a doormat pushover that a lot of people imagine it to be, but her will aligns with his, and she becomes a support for him as much as he is for her in some ways. And so this dynamic is fundamental to understanding, gender conflicts in today's society. And I think a lot of people don't understand that. So what you're saying is like, well, to be masculine is to be anti-feminine. It's very reactionary. There's
Yeah.
no understanding on any profound level of what it means to be masculine. It's just defined as not feminine.
Right,
And
right.
there's no definition beyond that. Sometimes you'll have people who are trying to approximate it by giving lists of traits, like a man does this, a man does that, he lives like this, he looks like that. Real men go to the gym. It's like, but that's so superficial and trivial, and none of it actually gets to the heart of the matter, which is that the essence of masculinity is that stable, unchanging, eternal principle, that axis within himself that he can project out into the world. The stronger of an axis a man has within himself, the more he finds that he inspires other people. Other people are drawn to him. Everybody probably knows like the one person in their social circle that everybody dumps their problems onto when they need something dealt with or fixed. The guy who's always reliable.
Yeah.
That's the guy with the most stable center in your social group. Everybody knows he's reliable, and he's reliable because he has that to some degree within him, to a greater degree than the people around him. And
That
this
was
is
yeah.
this is what men need to understand. That's your masculinity. It's that simple.
That's funny. That was my lived experience with the last place I worked at. There was a woman there who I was pretty friendly with, and she was an absolute train wreck. And she would always come to me and consult with me on her own life problems, usually romantic problems. And there was no sort of spark or anything between us. Like, she was the furthest thing from my mind. But I found it fascinating that she was always coming to me and not other guys. Maybe it's because I'm married, and that's a value judgment to her. But she would always have these like problems, and she would kind of just seek out guidance because I represented something that was not chaotic in herself. I was some center of gravity in her life, and I was just kind of relating it to that. I think that happens with
And
guys as
that's
they get
that's
older
what a
too.
man should be. That is what a man should aspire to be. Not to have the biggest muscles or the loudest voice or to have sex with the most women. None of that is masculine. None of that relates to any of this. It's to be that person that other people can find their center of gravity with. And
And also, let me just warn people. This is something I've said before, and it might not be anything that you're too passionate about. But I warn people that the wrong idea of masculinity is very easy to be hijacked by homosexuals, and I've seen it
yeah,
happen. I've seen it happen where a guy's like, you want to be strong, you want to be tough. What's tougher than gay sex? And then there's like
ugh.
a percentage of guys who'll be like, you know what, that tracks. That really, there's a bunch of guys in our scene who would be like, being a masculine, like even kind of like America First is like that, and they got a real gay problem in that scene. But it's like, yeah, you got to hate women. Like you can't be a guy unless you hate women and don't even want to have sex with women. Don't even try and engage with them romantically. I'm like, you got lost somewhere in there, I think.
Yeah, this is kind of a tacit admission of a very weakened masculinity. So one of the things you mentioned when you kind of told a story about this coworker that you had, and that maybe she came to you because you were married, and that counted for something with her. Well, from a traditional standpoint, a man could not become a sacred king unless basically he had a woman at his side. Really, he has to show that he is a stable enough axis that he can bring a woman into his orbit. And for a sacred king in these mythical stories, this is usually a supernatural woman of some kind, a goddess or some other like really kind of exceptional woman, typically speaking, and that he has to either seduce or conquer in some way, but to claim her for his own. And this is representative in myth of the masculine principle overcoming the feminine and establishing its dominance. And so, if you have men who are saying, well, I don't want to have anything to do with women, well, it's probably a good thing that they don't. It's good that they recognize that they should stay away from women, because it can be very dangerous. Women are both life and death to a man, and it can go one way or the other. And a man without the stable center is going to find death. I don't mean that necessarily literally, but metaphorically and metaphysically speaking, he becomes enslaved to his sense pleasures. It becomes about satisfying his sexual urges or his emotional needs or whatever, all these very feminine things that are part of the world of becoming. Whereas the man who has the stable center is focused on the vertical path. And so woman for him represents life, because she is the tool through which he completes the red work that we previously discussed and attains his salvation.
You know what? I think we just solved male-female relations.
I've been trying to say this for years, but man, Twitter does not give me the character limits I need.
How has your experience on Twitter been? I know you're very active on Twitter, and I encourage people to go to check you out. And I know you kind of getting involved with relationship dynamics a lot there. What's your experience been on there?
Well, I have to say, I get involved with it more than I want to, because lately that's all that comes up in my feed. I do not follow 2,000 people who only talk about relationship dynamics. But I'm not seeing any cat posts. I follow tons of cat accounts for one. I'm not seeing anything spiritual. I'm not even seeing anything like political current events. Nothing. This is like the only thing that's coming up in my feed for like the last several weeks at this point, maybe a couple months now. And so that just tends to be what I comment on, because that's what I see. But I mean, it is a big thing, and it's something that most people are interested in, because it's always such a salient point in our lives, right? Our primary relationship with the opposite sex is like pretty key to how we live our lives, how we feel about ourselves, our overall happiness. So it's natural that people would be interested in this. And everybody's trying to figure out like, what's the key? How do we unlock this? But they're always coming at it from this empirical standpoint that's not grounded in any deeper metaphysics. And I think Evola really hits the nail on the head with this. There's a chapter in Revolt called Man and Woman, which is relatively short and easy to read. I would recommend that to anybody who wants more insight. But also his book, Eros and the Mysteries of Love, which is one of my favorite ones. He really gets deeply into these dynamics of masculine and feminine, and what that means for traditional relationships between man and woman, how this is used in sacred ritual, and so on and so forth. So that's a great book. If you haven't read that one, you might enjoy it.
I'd love to give that a shot. I've only read Revolt Against the Modern World, and I've seen his pretty impressive selection here. I think there's a publisher that does a lot of Evola stuff. I think Arctos is the one that does a lot.
Arctos and Inner Traditions are his publishers in English.
Yeah, and they do pretty good work for him and translations and whatnot.
Yeah.
And I also want to say, I think I've asked you every single question I want to get to. We covered every aspect of what I wanted to cover today, and got very, very deep in a way that I don't think we got with Evola when we covered Revolt Against the Modern World. I think we kind of came at it more from a modern. Ironically, we came at it from a modern perspective. And I
Which is
just
totally fine. You got to start somewhere.
Yeah, just like when we read Renee Juanon, my fear was like we're coming at this like we're too materialist these days, but like we didn't really grasp the deeper spiritual level. But we're kind of getting to that in the show now. Before we leave, I did want to direct people towards your channels again to make sure that if people like what they heard today, you go way deeper into a lot of these topics. And your YouTube channel, especially, is very, very good for this stuff. I can't recommend your videos enough. And
Thank you.
good production quality too, which is very lacking in the scene. So I would encourage people to look up Philosophicat on Twitter. You can find her on Odyssey. You can find her on YouTube. You can find her on Subscribestar, and you can find her on Telegram, a very, very popular Telegram channel, which is important because some people, they really seem to pick one or the other. And I found someone will have like a huge Twitter and then like 20 followers on Telegram, but yours seems to be pretty well enough balanced. And I wanted to give it to you if there's any other thing you wanted to say that maybe you didn't get out during the interview.
Yeah, no, we covered a ton of ground and it's been a fun conversation. So I hope it's kind of clarified some of these ideas for you and your listeners. Obviously, like Revolt is a pretty dense book. It's not, it's not impossible to get through, but it's a decent size and there's a lot to think about. And if you are new to Evola, of course, coming at it from just a modern perspective is totally fine. Try to understand it, within the paradigm that you currently have, and then on a second reading, you'll find that you just naturally get deeper into it.
Yeah, and this is why I wanted to talk to people. Like getting into this stuff, it's at the very least a fascinating endeavor because it really makes you have to unpack how you look at the world and certain preconceptions you might have that you didn't even consider. And that to truly engage with the traditional, you need to rethink a lot of your assumptions. And I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with me today. And I hope we can speak again sometime soon.
Yeah, it's been my absolute pleasure. If you ever want to discuss Evola again, I'm happy to come back.
All right. Thank you very much. I'll see you later.
Do not let the rapists win. Listen and love Blood Satellite.